Thomas Paine was an English-American political activist, philosopher, political theorist and revolutionary. One of the founding fathers of the United States, he authored the two most influential pamphlets at the start of the American Revolution, and he inspired the rebels in 1776 to declare independence from Britain. His ideas reflected Enlightenment-era rhetoric of transnational human rights. He has been called a corset maker by trade, a journalist by profession, and a propagandist by inclination. Born in Thetford, England, in the county of Norfolk, Paine emigrated to the British-American colonies in 1774 with the help of Benjamin Franklin, arriving just in time to participate in the American Revolution. Virtually every rebel read his powerful pamphlet Common Sense. Proportionally, the all-time best-selling American title which crystallized the rebellious demand for independence from Great Britain. His The American Crisis was a pro-revolutionary pamphlet series. Common Sense was so influential that John Adams said, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." Paine lived in France for most of the 1790s, becoming deeply involved in the French Revolution. He wrote Rights of Man, in part a defense of the French Revolution against its critics. His attacks on British writer Edmund Burke led to a trial and conviction in absentia in 1792 for the crime of seditious libel. In 1792, despite not being able to speak French, he was elected to the French National Convention. The Girondists regarded him as an ally. Consequently, the Montagnards, especially Robespierre, regarded him as an enemy. In December 1793, he was arrested and imprisoned in Paris, then released in 1794. He became notorious because of his pamphlet The Age of Reason, in which he advocated deism, promoted reason and free thought, and argued against institutionalized religion in general and Christian doctrine in particular. He also published the pamphlet Agrarian Justice, discussing the origins of property, and introduced the concept of a guaranteed minimum income. In 1802, he returned to the U.S., where he died on June 8, 1809. Only 6 people attended his funeral as he had been ostracized for his ridicule of Christianity. Early life and education. Paine was born on January 29, 1736, the son of Joseph Paine, or Paine, a Quaker, and Frances, an Anglican, in Thetford, an important market town and coach stage post in rural Norfolk, England. Born Thomas Paine, despite claims that he changed his family name upon his emigration to America in 1774, he was using Paine in 1769. While still in Lewes, Sussex, he attended Thetford Grammar School, at a time when there was no compulsory education. At the age of 13, he was apprenticed to his staymaker father. Paine researchers contend his father's occupation has been widely misinterpreted to mean that he made the stays in ladies' corsets, which likely was an insult later invented by his political foes. Actually, the father and apprentice son made the thick rope stays used on sailing ships. Better source needed. Thetford historically had maintained a brisk trade with the Down River, then major port town of King's Lynn. A connection to shipping and the sea explains why, in late adolescence, Thomas enlisted and briefly served as a privateer. Better source needed. Before returning to Britain in 1759. There, he became a master staymaker, establishing a shop in Sandwich, Kent. On September 27, 1759, Thomas Paine married Mary Lambert. His business collapsed soon after. Mary became pregnant, and, after they moved to Margate, she went into early labor, in which she and their child died. In July 1761, Paine returned to Thetford to work as a supernumerary officer. In December 1762, he became an excise officer in Grantham, Lincolnshire. In August 1764, he was transferred to Alford, also in Lincolnshire, at a salary of £50 per annum. On August 27, 1765, he was dismissed as an excise officer for claiming to have inspected goods he did not not inspect. On July 31, 1766, he requested his reinstatement from the Board of Excise, which they granted the next day, upon vacancy. While awaiting that, he worked as a staymaker. Again, he was making stay ropes for shipping, not stays for corsets. In 1767, he was appointed to a position in Grampound, Cornwall. Subsequently, he asked to leave this post to await a vacancy. Thus, he became a schoolteacher in London. On February 19, 1768, he was appointed to Lewes in Sussex, a town with a tradition of opposition to the monarchy and pro-republican sentiments going back to the revolutionary decades of the 17th century. Here, he lived above the 15th-century Bull House, the tobacco shop of Samuel Olive and Esther Olive. There, Paine first became involved in civic matters, and he appears in the town book as a member of the court leet, the governing body for the town. He was also a member of the parish vestry, an influential local church group whose responsibilities for parish business would include collecting taxes and tithes to distribute among the poor. On March 26, 1771, at the age of 34, he married Elizabeth Olive, his landlord's daughter. From 1772 to 1773, Paine joined excise offices asking Parliament for better pay and working conditions, publishing, in summer of 1772, The Case of the Officers of Excise, a 21-page article, and his first political work, spending the London winter distributing the 4,000 copies printed to the Parliament and others. In spring of 1774, he was again dismissed from the excise service for being absent from his post without permission. His tobacco shop failed, too. On April 14, to avoid debtor's prison, he sold his household possessions to pay debts. On June 4, 1774, he formally separated from his wife Elizabeth and moved to London, where, in September, mathematician, Fellow of the Royal Society, and Commissioner of the Excise George Lewis Scott introduced him to Benjamin Franklin, who suggested emigration to British colonial America, and gave him a letter of recommendation. In October, Thomas Paine emigrated from Great Britain to the American colonies, arriving in Philadelphia on November 30, 1774. He barely survived the transatlantic voyage. The ship's water supplies were bad, and typhoid fever killed 5 passengers. On arriving at Philadelphia, he was too sick to debark. Benjamin Franklin's physician, there to welcome Paine to America, had him carried off ship. Paine took 6 weeks to recover his health. He became a citizen of Pennsylvania, by taking the oath of allegiance at a very early period. In January 1775, he became editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, a position he conducted with considerable ability. Paine designed the Sunderland Bridge of 1796 over the Ware River at Weymouth, England. It was patterned after the model he had made for the Schuylkill River Bridge at Philadelphia in 1787, and the Sunderland Arch became the prototype for many subsequent voussoir arches made in iron and steel. He also received a British patent for a single-span iron bridge, developed a smokeless candle, and worked with inventor John Fitch in developing steam engines. American Revolution. Common Sense. Thomas Paine has a claim to the title the father of the American Revolution. It rests on his pamphlets, especially Common Sense, which crystallized sentiment for independence in 1776. It was published in Philadelphia on January 10, 1776 and signed anonymously by an Englishman. It became an immediate success, quickly spreading 100,000 copies in 3 months to the 2 million residents of the 13 colonies. In all, about 500,000 copies total, including unauthorized editions, were sold during the course of the Revolution. Paine's original title for the pamphlet was Plain Truth. Paine's friend, pro-independence advocate Benjamin Rush, suggested Common Sense instead. The pamphlet came into circulation in January 1776, after the Revolution had started. It was passed around, and often read aloud in taverns, contributing significantly to spreading the idea of republicanism, bolstering enthusiasm for separation from Britain, and encouraging recruitment for the Continental Army. Paine provided a new and convincing argument for independence by advocating a complete break with history. Common Sense is oriented to the future in a way that compels the reader to make an immediate choice. It offers a solution for Americans disgusted with and alarmed at the threat of tyranny. Paine's attack on monarchy in Common Sense is essentially an attack on George III, whereas colonial resentments were originally directed primarily against the king's ministers and parliament. Paine laid the responsibility firmly at the king's door. Common Sense was the most widely read pamphlet of the American Revolution. It was a clarion call for unity against the corrupt British court, so as to realize America's providential role in providing an asylum for liberty. Written in a direct and lively style, it denounced the decaying despotisms of Europe and pilloried hereditary monarchy as an absurdity. At a time when many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, Common Sense demonstrated to many the inevitability of separation. Paine was not, on the whole, expressing original ideas in Common Sense, but rather employing rhetoric as a means to arouse resentment of the crown. To achieve these ends, he pioneered a style of political writing suited to the democratic society he envisioned, with Common Sense serving as a primary example. Part of Paine's work was to render complex ideas intelligible to average readers of the day, with clear, concise writing unlike the formal, learned style favored by many of Paine's contemporaries. Scholars have put forward various explanations to account for its success, including the historic moment, Paine's easy-to-understand style, his democratic ethos, and his use of psychology and ideology. Common Sense was immensely popular in disseminating to a very wide audience ideas that were already in common use among the elite who comprised Congress and the leadership cadre of the emerging nation, who rarely cited Paine's arguments in their public calls for independence. The pamphlet probably had little direct influence on the Continental Congress's decision to issue a Declaration of Independence, since that body was more concerned with how declaring independence would affect the war effort. Paine's great contribution was in initiating a public debate about independence which had previously been rather muted. One distinctive idea in Common Sense is Paine's beliefs regarding the peaceful nature of republics. His views were an early and strong conception of what scholars would come to call the democratic peace theory. Loyalists vigorously attacked Common Sense. One attack, titled Plain Truth by Mary Lander James Chalmers, said Paine was a political quack and warned that without monarchy, the government would degenerate into democracy. Even some American revolutionaries objected to Common Sense. Late in life, John Adams called it a crapulous mass. Adams disagreed with the type of radical democracy promoted by Paine, and published Thoughts on Government in 1776 to advocate a more conservative approach to republicanism. Sophia Rosenfeld argues that Paine was highly innovative in his use of the commonplace notion of common sense. He synthesized various philosophical and political uses of the term in a way that permanently impacted American political thought. He used two ideas from Scottish common sense realism: that ordinary people can indeed make sound judgments on major political issues, and that there exists a body of popular wisdom that is readily apparent to anyone. Paine also used a notion of common sense, favored by philosophers in the Continental Enlightenment. They held that common sense could refute the claims of traditional institutions. Thus, Paine used common sense as a weapon to delegitimize the monarchy and overturn prevailing conventional wisdom. Rosenfeld concludes that the phenomenal appeal of his pamphlet resulted from his synthesis of popular and elite elements in the independence movement. According to historian Robert Middlecalf, Common Sense became immensely popular mainly because Paine appealed to widespread convictions. Monarchy, he said, was preposterous, and it had a heathenish origin. It was an institution of the devil. Paine pointed to the Old Testament, where almost all kings had seduced the Israelites to worship idols instead of God. Paine also denounced aristocracy, which together with monarchy were two ancient tyrannies. They violated the laws of nature, human reason, and the universal order of things, which began with God. That was, Middlekauff says, exactly what most Americans wanted to hear. He calls the revolutionary generation the children of the twice-born, because in their childhood they had experienced the Great Awakening, which, for the first time, had tied Americans together, transcending denominational and ethnic boundaries and giving them a sense of patriotism. The American Crisis in late 1776. Paine published the American Crisis pamphlet series to inspire the Americans in their battles against the British Army. He juxtaposed the conflict between the good American devoted to civic virtue and the selfish provincial man. To inspire his soldiers, General George Washington had the American Crisis, First Crisis pamphlet, read aloud to them. It begins, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now, deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." Foreign Affairs. In 1777, Paine became Secretary of the Congressional Committee on Foreign Affairs. The following year, he alluded to secret negotiation underway with France in his pamphlets. His enemies denounced his indiscretions. There was scandal, together with Paine's conflict with Robert Morris and Silas Deane. It led to Paine's expulsion from the committee in 1779. However, in 1781, he accompanied John Laurens on his mission to France. Eventually, after much pleading from Paine, New York State recognized his political services by presenting him with an estate at New Rochelle, New York, and Paine received money from Pennsylvania and from Congress at Washington's suggestion. During the Revolutionary War, Paine served as an aide to the important General Nathanael Greene. The Silas Deane affair, in what may have been an error, and perhaps even contributed to his resignation as the Secretary to the Committee of Foreign Affairs. Paine was openly critical of Silas Deane, an American diplomat who had been appointed in March 1776 by the Congress to travel to France in secret. Deane's goal was to influence the French government to finance the colonists in the fight for independence. Paine largely saw Deane as a war profiteer who had little respect for principle, having been under the employ of Robert Morris, one of the primary financiers of the American Revolution, and working with Pierre Beaumarchais, a French royal agent sent to the colonies by King Louis to investigate the Anglo-American conflict. Paine labeled Deane as unpatriotic, and demanded that there be a public investigation into Morris's financing of the revolution, as he had contracted with his own company for around $500,000. Unfortunately, Paine's criticisms turned against him. Amongst his criticisms, he had written in the Pennsylvania packet that France had prefaced their alliance by an early and generous friendship, referring to aid that had been provided to American colonies prior to the recognition of the Franco-American treaties. It was effectively an embarrassment on France, which potentially could have jeopardized the alliance. John Jay, the president of the Congress who had been a fervent supporter of Deane, immediately spoke out against Paine's comments. The controversy eventually became public, and Paine was then denounced as unpatriotic for criticizing an American revolutionary. He was even physically assaulted twice in the street by Deane supporters. This much added stress took a large toll on Paine, who was generally of a sensitive character, and resigned as secretary to the Committee of Foreign Affairs in 1779. Funding the revolution, Paine accompanied Col. John Laurens to France and is credited with initiating the mission. It landed in France in March 1781 and returned to America in August with 2.5 million livres in silver, as part of a present of 6 million and a loan of 10 million. The meetings with the French king were most likely conducted in the company and under the influence of Benjamin Franklin. Upon returning to the United States with this highly welcomed cargo, Thomas Paine and probably Col. Laurens positively objected that General Washington should propose that Congress remunerate him for his services, for fear of setting a bad precedent in an improper mode. Paine made influential acquaintances in Paris, and helped organize the Bank of North America to raise money to supply the army. In 1785, he was given $3,000 by the U.S. Congress in recognition of his service to the nation. Henry Laurens had been the ambassador to the Netherlands, but he was captured by the British on his return trip there. When he was later exchanged for the prisoner Lord Cornwallis, Paine proceeded to the Netherlands to continue the loan negotiations. There remains some question as to the relationship of Henry Laurens and Thomas Paine to Robert Morris as the superintendent of finance and his business associate Thomas Willing, who became the first president of the Bank of North America. They had accused Morris of profiteering in 1779, and Willing had voted against the Declaration of Independence. Although Morris did much to restore his reputation in 1780 and 1781, the credit for obtaining these critical loans to organize the Bank of North America for approval by Congress in December 1781 should go to Henry or John Laurens and Thomas Paine more than to Robert Morris. Paine bought his only house in 1783 on the corner of Farnsworth Avenue and Church Streets in Bordentown City, New Jersey, and he lived in it periodically until his death in 1809. This is the only place in the world where Paine purchased real estate. His design for a single-arch iron bridge led him back to Europe after the Revolution, where he tried, unsuccessfully, to find backers for his plans.